The fact is, Benno said, he had overheard a dialogue between Adelmo and Berengar in which Berengar, referring to a secret Adelmo was asking him to reveal, proposed a vile barter, which even the most innocent reader can imagine. And it seems that from Adelmo's lips Benno heard words of consent, spoken as if with relief. As if, Benno ventured, Adelmo at heart desired nothing else, and it sufficed for him to find some excuse other than carnal desire in order to agree. A sign, Benno argued, that Berengar's secret must have concerned arcana of learning, so that Adelmo could harbor the illusion of submitting to a sin of the flesh to satisfy a desire of the intellect. And, Benno added with a smile, how many times had he himself not been stirred by desires of the intellect so violent that to satisfy them he would have consented to complying with others' carnal desires, even against his own inclination. Are there not moments, he asked William, when you would also do shameful things to get your hands on a book you have been seeking for years? The wise and most virtuous Sylvester II, centuries ago, gave as a gift a most precious armillary sphere in exchange for a manuscript, I believe, of Statius or Lucan, William said. He added then, prudently, but it was an armillary sphere, not his virtue. Benno admitted that his enthusiasm had carried him away, and he resumed his story. The night before Adelmo's death, Benno followed the pair, driven by curiosity, and he saw them, after Compline, go off together to the dormitory. He waited a long time, holding ajar the door of his cell, not far from theirs, and when silence had fallen over the sleep of the monks, he clearly saw Adelmo slip into Berengar's cell. Benno remained awake, unable to fall asleep, until he heard Berengar's door open again and Adelmo flee, almost running, as his friend tried to hold him back. Berengar followed Adelmo down to the floor below. Cautiously Benno went after them, and at the mouth of the lower corridor he saw Berengar, trembling, huddled in a corner, staring at the door of Jorge's cell. Benno guessed that Adelmo had flung himself at the feet of the venerable brother to confess his sin. And Berengar was trembling, knowing his secret was being revealed, even if under the seal of the sacrament. Then Adelmo came out, his face pale, thrust away Berengar, who was trying to speak to him, and rushed out of the dormitory, moving behind the apse of the church and entering the choir from the north door, which at night remains open. Probably he wanted to pray. Berengar followed him but did not enter the church. He wandered among the graves in the cemetery, wringing his hands. Benno was wondering what to do when he realized that a fourth person was moving about the vicinity. This person, too, had followed the pair and certainly had not noticed the presence of Benno, who flattened himself against the trunk of an oak growing at the edge of the cemetery. The fourth man was Venantius. At the sight of him Berengar crouched among the graves, as Venantius also went into the choir. At this point, fearing he would be discovered, Benno returned to the dormitory. The next morning Adelmo's corpse was found at the foot of the cliff. And more than that, Benno did not know. Dinner hour was now approaching. Benno left us, and my master asked him noting further. We remained for a little while behind the balneary, then strolled briefly in the garden, meditating on those singular revelations. Frangula, William said suddenly, bending over to observe a plant that, on that winter day, he recognized from the bare bush. A good infusion is made from the bark, for hemorrhoids. And that is Arctium lapa, a good cataplasm of fresh roots cicatrizes skin eczemas. You are cleverer than Severinus, I said to him, but now tell me what you think of what we have heard. Dear Adza, you should learn to think with your own head. Benno probably told us the truth. His story fits with what Berengar told us early this morning, for all its hallucinations. Berengar and Adelmo do something very evil together, we had already guessed that. And Berengar must reveal to Adelmo that secret that remains, alas, a secret. Adelmo, after committing his crime against chastity and the law of nature, thinks only of confiding in someone who can absolve him, and he rushes to Jorge, whose character is very stern, as we know from experience, and he surely attacks Adelmo with distressing reprimands. Perhaps he refuses absolution, perhaps he imposes an impossible penance. We don't know, nor would Jorge ever tell us. The fact remains that Adelmo rushes into church and prostrates himself before the altar, but doesn't quell his remorse. At this point, he is approached by Venantius. We don't know what they say to each other. Perhaps Adelmo confides in Venantius the secret received as a gift, or as payment, from Berengar, which no longer matters to him, since he now has a far more terrible and burning secret. What happens to Venantius? Perhaps, overcome by the same ardent curiosity that today also seized our friend Benno, satisfied with what he has learned, he leaves Adelmo to his remorse. Adelmo sees himself abandoned, determines to kill himself, comes in despair to the cemetery, and there encounters Berengar. He says terrible words to him, flings his responsibilities at him, calls him his master in turpitude. I believe, actually, that Berengar's story, stripped of all hallucination, was exact. Adelmo repeats to him the same words of desperation he must have heard from Jorge. And now Berengar, overcome, goes off in one direction, and Adelmo goes in the other, to kill himself. Then comes the rest, of which we were almost witnesses. All believe Adelmo was murdered, so Venantius has the impression that the secret of the library is more important than he had believed, and he continues the search on his own. Until someone stops him, either before or after he has discovered what he wanted. Who killed him? Berengar? Perhaps. Or Malachi, who must guard the edificium. Or someone else. Berengar is suspect because he is frightened, and he knew that by then Venantius possessed his secret. Malachi is suspect. Guardian of the inviolability of the library, he discovers someone has violated it, and he kills. Jorge knows everything about everyone, possesses Adelmo's secret, does not want me to discover what Venantius may have found. Many facts would point to him. But tell me how a blind man can kill another man in the fullness of his strength. And how can an old man, even if strong, carry the body to the jar? But finally, why couldn't the murderer be Benno himself? He could have lied to us, impelled by reasons that cannot be confessed. And why limit our suspicions only to those who took part in the discussion of laughter? Perhaps the crime had other motives, which have nothing to do with the library. In any case, we need two things: to know how to get into the library at night, and a lamp. You provide the lamp. Linger in the kitchen at dinner hour, take one. A theft? Alone, to the greater glory of the Lord. If that is so, then count on me. Good. As for getting into the edificium, we saw where Malachi came from last night. Today I will visit the church, and that chapel in particular. In an hour we go to table. Afterward we have a meeting with the abbot. You will be admitted, because I have asked to bring a secretary to make a note of what we say. Nuns. In which the abbot declares his pride in the wealth of his abbey and his fear of heretics, and eventually Adzo wonders whether he has made a mistake in going forth into the world. We found the abbot in church, at the main altar. He was following the work of some novices who had brought forth from a secret place a number of sacred vessels, chalices, pattens, and monstrances, and a crucifix I had not seen during the morning function. I could not repress a cry of wonder at the dazzling beauty of those holy objects. It was noon and the light came in bursts through the choir windows, and even more through those of the facade, creating white cascades that, like mystic streams of divine substance, intersected at various points of the church, engulfing the altar itself. The vases, the chalices, each piece revealed its precious materials. Amid the yellow of the gold, the immaculate white of the ivory, and the transparency of the crystal, I saw gleaming gems of every color and dimension, and I recognized jacinth, topaz, ruby, sapphire, emerald, chrysolite, onyx, carbuncle, and jasper and agate. And at the same time I realized how, that morning, first transported by prayer and then overcome with terror, I had failed to notice many things. The altar frontal and 3 other panels that flanked it were entirely of gold, and eventually the whole altar seemed of gold, from whatever direction I looked at it. The abbot smiled at my amazement. These riches you see, he said, addressing me and my master, and others you will see later, are the heritage of centuries of piety and devotion, testimony to the power and holiness of this abbey. Princes and potentates of the earth, archbishops and bishops have sacrificed to this altar and to the objects destined for it the rings of their investiture, the gold and precious stones that were the emblem of their greatness, to have them melted down here to the greater glory of the Lord and of this his place. Though today the abbey is distressed by another, sad event, we must not forget, reminded of our fragility, the strength and power of the Almighty. The celebration of the Holy Nativity is approaching, and we are beginning to polish the sacred vessels, so that the Savior's birth may be celebrated with all the pomp and magnificence it deserves and demands. Everything must appear in its full splendor, he added, looking hard at William, and afterward I understood why he insisted so proudly on justifying his action, because we believe it useful and fitting not to hide, but on the contrary to proclaim divine generosity. Certainly, William said politely, if your sublimity feels that the Lord must be so glorified, your abbey has achieved the greatest excellence in this meed of praise. And so it must be, the abbot said. If it was the custom that amphoras and phials of gold and little gold mortars served, by the will of God or order of the prophets, to collect the blood of goats or calves or of the heifer in the temple of Solomon, then there is all the more reason why vases of gold and precious stones, and the most valuable things created, should be used with constant reverence and complete devotion to receive the blood of Christ. If in a second creation our substance were to be the same as that of the cherubim and the seraphim, the service it could perform for such an ineffable victim would still be unworthy. Amen, I said. Many protest that a devoutly inspired mind, a pure heart, a will led by faith should suffice for this sacred function. We are the first to declare explicitly and resolutely that these are the essential things, but we are convinced that homage must also be paid through the exterior ornament of the sacred vessel, because it is profoundly right and fitting that we serve our Savior in all things, totally. He who has not refused to provide for us, totally and without reservation. This has always been the opinion of the great men of your order, William agreed, and I recall beautiful things written on the ornaments of churches by the very great and venerable Abbot Sugar. True, the abbot said. You see this crucifix. It is not yet complete. He took it in his hand with infinite love, gazed at it, his face radiant with bliss. Some pearls are still missing here, for I have found none the right size. Once St. Andrew addressed the cross of Golgotha, saying it was adorned with the limbs of Christ as with pearls. And pearls must adorn this humble simulacrum of that great wonder. Still, I have found it proper to set, here, over the very head of the Savior, the most beautiful diamond you will ever see. His devout hands, his long white fingers, stroked the most precious parts of the sacred wood, or rather, the sacred ivory, for this noble material had served to form the arms of the cross. As I take pleasure in all the beauties of this house of God, when the spell of the many-colored stones has torn me from outside concerns and a worthy meditation has led me to reflect, transferring that which is material to that which is immaterial, on the diversity of the sacred virtues, then I seem to find myself, so to speak, in a strange region of the universe, no longer completely enclosed in the mire of the earth or completely free in the purity of heaven. And it seems to me that, by the grace of God, I can be transported from this lower world to that higher world by anagoge. As he spoke, he turned his face to the nave. A shaft of light from above was illuminating his countenance, through a special benevolence of the daystar, and his hands, which he had extended in the form of a cross, caught up as he was in his fervor. Every creature, he said, visible or invisible, is a light, brought into being by the Father of lights. This ivory, this onyx, but also the stone that surrounds us, are a light, because I perceive that they are good and beautiful, that they exist according to their own rules of proportion, that they differ in genus and species from all other genera and species, that they are defined by their own number, that they are true to their order, that they seek their specific place according to their weight. And the more these things are revealed to me, the more the matter I gaze on is by its nature precious, and the better illuminated is the divine power of creation. For if I must strive to grasp the sublimity of the cause, inaccessible in its fullness, through the sublimity of the effect, how much better am I told of the divine causality by an effect as wondrous as gold and diamond, if even dung or an insect can speak to me of it. And then, when I perceive in these stones such superior things, the soul weeps, moved to joy, and not through terrestrial vanity or love of riches, but through the purest love of the prime, uncaused cause. Truly this is the sweetest of theologies, William said, with perfect humility, and I thought he was using that insidious figure of speech that readers call irony, which must always be prefaced by the pronunciatio, representing its signal and its justification, something William never did. For which reason the abbot, more inclined to the use of figures of speech, took William literally and added, still in the power of his mystical transport, it is the most immediate of the paths that put us in touch with the Almighty. Theophanic matter. William coughed politely. He said. This is what he did when he wanted to introduce a new subject. He managed to do it gracefully because it was his habit, and I believe this is typical of the men of his country, to begin every remark with long preliminary moans, as if starting the exposition of a completed thought cost him a great mental effort. Whereas, I am now convinced, the more groans he uttered before his declaration, the surer he was of the soundness of the proposition he was expressing. William continued, we should talk of the meeting and the debate on poverty. Poverty, the abbot said, still lost in thought, as if having a hard time coming down from that beautiful region of the universe to which his gems had transported him. Yes, the meeting. And they began an intense discussion of things that in part one already knew and in part one managed to grasp as I listened to their talk. As I said at the beginning of this faithful chronicle, it concerned the double quarrel that had set, on the one hand, the emperor against the pope, and, on the other, the pope against the Franciscans, who in the Perugia chapter, though only after many years, had espoused the spiritual's theories about the poverty of Christ, and it concerned the jumble that had been created as the Franciscans sided with the empire, a triangle of oppositions and alliances that had now been transformed into a square, thanks to the intervention, to me still very obscure, of the abbots of the order of St. Benedict. I never clearly grasped the reason why the Benedictine abbots had given refuge and protection to the spiritual Franciscans, some time before their own order came to share their opinions to a certain extent. Because if the spirituals preached the renunciation of all worldly goods, the abbots of my order, I had seen that very day the radiant confirmation, followed a path no less virtuous, though exactly the opposite. But I believe the abbots felt that excessive power for the pope meant excessive power for the bishops in the cities, whereas my order had retained its power intact through the centuries precisely by opposing the secular clergy and the city merchants, setting itself as direct mediator between earth and heaven, and as advisor of sovereigns. I had often heard repeated the motto according to which the people of God were divided into shepherds, namely, the clerics, dogs, that is, warriors, and sheep, the populace. But I later learned that this sentence can be rephrased in several ways. The Benedictines had often spoken, not of three orders, but of two great divisions, one involving the administration of earthly things and the other the administration of heavenly things. As far as earthly things went, there was a valid division into clergy, lay lords, and populace, but this tripartite division was dominated by the presence of the Ordo Monachorum, direct link between God's people and heaven, and the monks had no connection with those secular shepherds, the priests and bishops, ignorant and corrupt, now supine before the interests of the cities, where the sheep were no longer the good and faithful peasants but, rather, the merchants and artisans. The Benedictine order was not sorry that the governing of the simple should be entrusted to the secular clerics, provided it was the monks who established the definitive regulation of this government, the monks being in direct contact with the source of all earthly power, the empire, just as they were with the source of all heavenly power. This, I believe, is why many Benedictine abbots, to restore dignity to the empire against the government of the cities, bishops and merchants united, agreed to protect the spiritual Franciscans, whose ideas they did not share but whose presence was useful to them, since it offered the empire good syllogisms against the overweening power of the Pope. These were the reasons, I then deduced, why ABO was now preparing to collaborate with William, the emperor's envoy, and to act as mediator between the Franciscan order and the papal throne. In fact, even in the violence of the dispute that so endangered the unity of the Church, Michael of Cesena, several times called to Avignon by Pope John, was ultimately prepared to accept the invitation, because he did not want his order to place itself in irrevocable conflict with the pontiff. As general of the Franciscans, he wanted at once to see their positions triumph and to obtain papal assent, not least because he surmised that without the Pope's agreement he would not be able to remain for long at the head of the order. But many had assured him the Pope would be awaiting him in France to ensnare him, charge him with heresy, and bring him to trial. Therefore, they advised that Michael's appearance at Avignon should be preceded by negotiations. Marsilius had a better idea, to send with Michael an imperial envoy who would present to the Pope the point of view of the emperor's supporters. Not so much to convince old Cahors but to strengthen the position of Michael, who, as part of an imperial legation, would not then be such easy prey to papal vengeance. This idea, however, had numerous disadvantages and could not be carried out immediately. Hence the idea of a preliminary meeting between the imperial legation and some envoys of the Pope, to essay their respective positions and to draw up the agreement for a further encounter at which the safety of the Italian visitors would be guaranteed. To organize this first meeting, William of Baskerville had been appointed. Later, he would present the imperial theologian's point of view at Avignon, if he deemed the journey possible without danger. A far from simple enterprise, because it was supposed that the Pope, who wanted Michael alone in order to be able to reduce him more readily to obedience, would send to Italy a mission with instructions to make the planned journey of the imperial envoys to his court a failure, as far as possible. William had acted till now with great ability. After long consultations with various Benedictine abbots, this was the reason for the many stops along our journey, he had chosen the abbey where we now were, precisely because the abbot was known to be devoted to the empire and yet, through his great diplomatic skill, not disliked by the papal court. Neutral territory, therefore, this abbey where the two groups could meet. But the Pope's resistance was not exhausted. He knew that, once his legation was on the abbey's terrain, it would be subject to the abbot's jurisdiction. And since some of his envoys belonged to the secular clergy, he would not accept this control, claiming fears of an imperial plot. He had therefore made the condition that his envoy's safety be entrusted to a company of archers of the King of France, under the command of a person in the Pope's trust. I had vaguely listened as William discussed this with an ambassador of the Pope at Bobbio. It was a matter of defining the formula to prescribe the duties of this company, or, rather, defining what was meant by the guaranteeing of the safety of the papal legates. A formula proposed by the Avignones had finally been accepted, for it seemed reasonable. The armed men and their officers would have jurisdiction over all those who in any way made an attempt on the life of members of the papal delegation or tried to influence their behavior or judgment by acts of violence. Then the pact had seemed inspired by purely formal preoccupations. Now, after the recent events at the abbey, the abbot was uneasy, and he revealed his doubts to William. If the legation arrived at the abbey while the author of the two crimes was still unknown, and the following day the abbot's worries were to increase, because the crimes would increase to 3, they would have to confess that within those walls someone in circulation was capable of influencing the judgment and behavior of the papal envoys with acts of violence. Trying to conceal the crimes committed would be of no avail, because if anything further were to happen, the papal envoys would suspect a plot against them. And so there were only two solutions. Either William discovered the murderer before the arrival of the legation, and here the abbot stared hard at him as if silently reproaching him for not having resolved the matter yet, or else the Pope's envoy had to be informed frankly and his collaboration sought, to place the abbey under close surveillance during the course of the discussions. The abbot did not like this second solution, because it meant renouncing part of his sovereignty and submitting his own monks to French control. But he could run no risks. William and the abbot were both vexed by the turn things were taking, however, they had few choices. They proposed, therefore, to come to a final decision during the next day. Meanwhile, they could only entrust themselves to divine mercy and to William's sagacity. "I will do everything possible, your sublimity," William said. "But, on the other hand, I fail to see how the matter can really compromise the meeting. Even the papal envoy will understand that there is a difference between the act of a madman or sanguinary, or perhaps only of a lost soul, and the grave proems that upright men will meet to discuss." "You think so?" the abbot asked, looking hard at William. "Remember, the Avignones know there to meet Minorites, and therefore very dangerous persons, close to the Fraticelli and others even more demented than the Fraticelli, dangerous heretics who are stained with crimes." Here the abbot lowered his voice, "compared with which the events that have taken place here, horrible as they are, pale like mist in the sun." "It is not the same thing," William cried sharply. "You cannot put the Minorites of the Perugia chapter on the same level as some bands of heretics who have misunderstood the message of the gospel, transforming the struggle against riches into a series of private vendettas or bloodthirsty follies. It is not many years since, not many miles from here, one of those bands, as you call them, put to fire and the sword the estates of the Bishop of Vercelli in the mountains beyond Novara," the abbot said curtly. "You speak of Fra Dolcino and the apostles." "The pseudo-apostles," the abbot corrected him. And once more I heard Fra Dolcino and the pseudo-apostles mentioned, and once more in a circumspect tone, with almost a hint of terror. "The pseudo-apostles," William readily agreed. "But they had no connection with the Minorites, with whom they shared the same professed reverence for Joachim of Calabria," the abbot persisted, "and you can ask your brother Uberdino." "I must point out to your sublimity that now he is a brother of your own order," William said, with a smile and a kind of bow, as if to compliment the abbot on the gain his order had made by receiving a man of such renown. I know. The abbot smiled. And you know with what fraternal care our order welcomed the spirituals when they incurred the Pope's wrath. I am not speaking only of Uberdino, but also of many other, more humble brothers, of whom little is known, and of whom perhaps we should know more. Because it has happened that we accepted fugitives who presented themselves garbed in the habit of the Minorites, and afterward I learned that the various vicissitudes of their life had brought them, for a time, quite close to the Dulcinians. Here, too? William asked. Here, too. I am revealing to you something about which, to tell the truth, I know very little, and in any case not enough to pronounce accusations. But inasmuch as you are investigating the life of this abbey, it is best for you to know these things also. I will tell you, further, that on the basis of things I have heard or surmised, I suspect, mind you, only suspect, that there was a very dark moment to the life of our cellarer, who arrived here, in fact, 2 years ago, following the exodus of the Minorites. The cellarer? Remigio of Verigine Dulcinian? He seems to me the mildest of creatures, and, for that matter, the least interested in sister poverty that I have ever seen. William said, I can say nothing against him, and I make use of his good services, for which the whole community is also grateful to him. But I mention this to make you understand how easy it is to find connections between a friar of ours and a fraticello. Once again your magnanimity is misplaced, if I may say so, William interjected. We were talking about Dulcinians, not fraticelli. And much can be said about the Dulcinians without anyone's really knowing who is being discussed, because there are many kinds. Still, they cannot be called sanguinary. At most they can be reproached for putting into practice without much consideration things that the spirituals preached with greater temperance, animated by true love of God, and here I agree the borderline between one group and the other is very fine. But the fraticelli are heretics, the abbot interrupted sharply. They do not confine themselves to sustaining the poverty of Christ and the apostles, a doctrine that, though I cannot bring myself to share it, can be usefully opposed to the haughtiness of Avignon. The fraticelli derive from that doctrine a practical syllogism. They infer a right to revolution, to looting, to the perversion of behavior. But which fraticelli? All, in general. You know they are stained with unmentionable crimes, they do not recognize matrimony, they deny hell, they commit sodomy, they embrace the Bogomil heresy of the Ordo Bulgariae and the Ordo Drygonthi. Please, William said, do not mix things that are separate. You speak as if the fraticelli, Patarines, Waldensians, Catharists, and within these the Bogomils of Bulgaria and the heretics of Dragovica, were all the same thing. They are, the abbot said sharply, they are because they are heretics, and they are because they jeopardize the very order of the civilized world, as well as the order of the empire you seem to me to favor. 100 or more years ago the followers of Arnold of Brescia set fire to the houses of the nobles and the cardinals, and these were the fruits of the Lombard heresy of the Patarines. Abo, William said, you live in the isolation of this splendid and holy abbey, far from the wickedness of the world. Life in the cities is far more complex than you believe, and there are degrees, you know, also in error and in evil. Lot was much less a sinner than his fellow citizens who conceived foul thoughts also about the angels sent by God, and the betrayal of Peter was nothing compared with the betrayal of Judas. One, indeed, was forgiven, the other not. You cannot consider Patarines and Catharists the same thing. The Patarines were a movement to reform behavior within the laws of Holy Mother Church. They wanted always to improve the ecclesiastic's behavior, maintaining that the sacraments should not be received from impure priests. And they were mistaken, but it was their only error of doctrine. They never proposed to alter the law of God. But the Patarine preaching of Arnold of Brescia, in Rome, more than 200 years ago, drove the mob of rustics to burn the houses of the nobles and the cardinals. Arnold tried to draw the magistrates of the city into his reform movement. They did not follow him, and he found support among the crowds of the poor and the outcast. He was not responsible for the violence and the anger with which they responded to his appeals for a less corrupt city. The city is always corrupt. The city is the place where today live the people of God, of whom we, are the shepherds. It is the place of scandal in which the rich prelates preach virtue to poor and hungry people. The Patarine disorders were born of this situation. They are sad, but not incomprehensible. The Catharists are something else. That is an Oriental heresy, outside the doctrine of the Church. I don't know whether they really commit or have committed the crimes attributed to them. I know they reject matrimony, they deny hell. I wonder whether many acts they have not committed have been attributed to them only because of the ideas, surely unspeakable, they have upheld. And you tell me that the Catharists have not mingled with the Patarines, and that both are not simply two of the faces, the countless faces, of the same demonical phenomenon? I say that many of these heresies, independently of the doctrines they assert, encounter success among the simple because they suggest to such people the possibility of a different life. I say that very often the simple do not know much about doctrine. I say that often hordes of simple people have confused Catharist preaching with that of the Patarines, and these together with that of the spirituals. The life of the simple, abo, is not illuminated by learning and by the lively sense of distinctions that makes us wise. And it is haunted by illness and poverty, tongue-tied by ignorance. Joining a heretical group, for many of them, is often only another way of shouting their own despair. You may burn a cardinal's house because you want to perfect the life of the clergy, but also because you believe that the hell he preaches does not exist. It is always done because on earth there does exist a hell, where lives the flock whose shepherds we no longer are. But you know very well that, Just as they do not distinguish between the Bulgarian church and the followers of the priest Leprondo, so often the imperial authorities and their supporters did not distinguish between spirituals and heretics. Not infrequently, imperial forces, to combat their adversaries, encouraged Catharist tendencies among the populace. In my opinion, they acted wrongly. But what I now know is that the same forces often, to rid themselves of these restless and dangerous and too simple adversaries, attributed to one group the heresies of the others, and flung them all on the pyre. I have seen, I swear to you, ABO, I have seen with my own eyes, men of virtuous life, sincere followers of poverty and chastity, but enemies of the bishops, whom the bishops thrust into the hands of the secular arm, whether it was in the service of the empire or of the free cities, accusing these men of sexual promiscuity, sodomy, unspeakable practices, of which others, perhaps, but not they, had been guilty. The simple are meat for slaughter, to be used when they are useful in causing trouble for the opposing power, and to be sacrificed when they are no longer of use. Therefore, the abbot said, with obvious maliciousness, were Fra Dolcino and his madmen, and Gerardo Cigarelli and those evil murderers, wicked Catharists or virtuous Fraticelli, sodomite Bogomils or Paterine reformers? Will you tell me, William, you who know so much about heretics that you've seen one of them, where the truth lies? Nowhere, at times, William said, sadly. You see, you yourself can no longer distinguish between one heretic and another. I at least have a rule. I know that heretics are those who endanger the order that sustains the people of God. And I defend the empire because it guarantees this order for me. I combat the Pope because he is handing the spiritual power over to the bishops of the cities, who are allied with the merchants and the corporations and will not be able to maintain this order. We have maintained it for centuries. And as for the heretics, I also have a rule, and it is summed up in the reply that Arnaldo Malarigas, Bishop of Cito, gave to those who asked him what to do with the citizens of Beziers. Kill them all, God will recognize his own. William lowered his eyes and remained silent for a while. Then he said, the city of Beziers was captured and our forces had no regard for dignity of sex or age, and almost 20,000 people were put to the sword. When the massacre was complete, the city was sacked and burned. A holy war is nevertheless a war. For this reason perhaps there should not be holy wars. But what am I saying? I am here to defend the rights of Louis, who is also putting Italy to the sword. I, too, find myself caught in a game of strange alliances. Strange the alliance between spirituals and the empire, and strange that of the empire with Marsilius, who seeks sovereignty for the people. And strange the alliance between the two of us, so different in our ideas and traditions. But we have two tasks in common, the success of the meeting and the discovery of a murderer. Let us try to proceed in peace. The abbot held out his arms. Give me the kiss of peace, brother William. With a man of your knowledge I could argue endlessly about fine points of theology and morals. We must not give way, however, to the pleasure of disputation, as the masters of Paris do. You are right. We have an important task ahead of us, and we must proceed in agreement. But I have spoken of these things because I believe there is a connection. Do you understand? A possible connection, or rather, a connection others can make, between the crimes that have occurred here and the theses of your brothers. This is why I have warned you, and this is why we must ward off every suspicion or insinuation on the part of the Avignones. Am I not also to suppose your sublimity has suggested to me a line for my inquiry? Do you believe that the source of the recent events can be found in some obscure story dating back to the heretical past of one of the monks? The abbot was silent for a few moments, looking at William but allowing no expression to be read on his face. Then he said, in this sad affair you are the inquisitor. It is your task to be suspicious, even to risk unjust suspicion. Here I am only the general father. And, I will add, if I knew that the past of one of my monks lent itself to well-founded suspicion, I would myself already have taken care to uproot the unhealthy plant. What I know, you know. What I do not know should properly be brought to light by your wisdom. He nodded to us and left the church. The story is becoming more complicated, dear Adza, William said, frowning. We pursue a manuscript, we become interested in the diatribes of some overcurious monks and in the actions of other, overlustful ones, and now, more and more insistently, an entirely different trail emerges. The cellarer, then, and with the cellarer that strange animal Salvatore also arrived here. But now we must go and rest, because we plan to stay awake during the night. Then you still mean to enter the library tonight? You are not going to abandon that first trail? Not at all. Anyway, who says the two trails are separate? And finally, this business of the cellarer could merely be a suspicion of the abbot's. He started toward the pilgrim's hospice. On reaching the threshold, he stopped and spoke, as if continuing his earlier remarks. After all, the abbot asked me to investigate Adelmo's death when he thought that something unhealthy was going on among his young monks. But now that the death of Venantius arouses other suspicions, perhaps the abbot has sensed that the key to the mystery lies in the library, and there he does not wish any investigating. So he offers me the suggestion of the cellarer, to distract my attention from the edificium. But why would he not want? Don't ask too many questions. The abbot told me at the beginning that the library was not to be touched. He must have his own good reasons. It could be that he is involved in some matter he thought unrelated to Adelmo's death, and now he realizes the scandal is spreading and could also touch him. And he doesn't want the truth to be discovered, or at least he doesn't want me to be the one who discovers it. Then we are living in a place abandoned by God, I said, disheartened. Have you found any places where God would have felt at home? William asked me, looking down from his great height. Then he sent me to rest. As I lay on my pallet, I concluded that my father should not have sent me out into the world, which was more complicated than I had thought. I was learning too many things. Salva me ab Aurelianus, I prayed as I fell asleep. After Vespers, in which, though the chapter is short, old Alenardo says very interesting things about the labyrinth and about the way to enter it. I woke when it was almost tolling the hour for the evening meal. I felt dull and somnolent, for daytime sleep is like the sin of the flesh. The more you have the more you want, and yet you feel unhappy, sated and unsated at the same time. William was not to his cell, obviously he had risen much earlier. I found him, after a brief search, coming out of the edificium. He told me he had been in the scriptorium, leafing through the catalogue and observing the monks at work, while trying to approach Venantius's desk and resume his inspection. But for one reason or another, each monk seemed bent on keeping him from searching among those papers. First Malachi had come over to him, to show him some precious illuminations. Then Benno had kept him busy on trifling pretexts. Still later, when he had bent over to resume his examination, Berengar had begun hovering around him, offering his collaboration. Finally, seeing that my master appeared seriously determined to look into Venantius's things, Malachi told him outright that, before rummaging among the dead man's papers, he ought perhaps to obtain the abbot's authorization, that he himself, even though he was the librarian, had refrained, out of respect and discipline, from looking, and that in any case, as William had requested, no one had approached that desk, and no one would approach it until the abbot gave instructions. William realized it was not worth engaging in a test of strength with Malachi, though all that stir and those fears about Venantius's papers had of course increased his desire to become acquainted with them. But he was so determined to get back in there that night, though he still did not know how, that he decided not to create incidents. He was harboring, however, thoughts of retaliation, which, if they had not been inspired as they were by a thirst for truth, would have seemed very stubborn and perhaps reprehensible. Before entering the refectory, we took another little walk in the cloister, to dispel the mists of sleep in the cold evening air. Some monks were still walking there in meditation. In the garden opening off the cloister we glimpsed old Alenardo of Grottaferrata, who, by now feeble of body, spent a great part of his day among the trees. When he was not in church praying, he seemed not to feel the cold, and he was sitting in the outer porch. William spoke a few words of greeting to him, and the old man seemed happy that someone should spend time with him. "A peaceful day," William said. "By the grace of God," the old man answered. "Peaceful in the heavens, but grim on earth. Did you know Venantius well?" "Venantius who?" the old man said. Then a light flashed in his eyes. "Ah, the dead boy. The beast is roaming about the abbey." "What beast?" "The great beast that comes from the sea. 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads 3 names of blasphemy. The beast like unto a leopard, with the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion." "I have seen him." "Where have you seen him?" "In the library." "Library? Why there? I have not gone to the scriptorium for years, and I have never seen the library." "No one goes to the library." "I knew those who did go up to the library." "Who? Malachi? Berengar?" "Oh, no," the old man said, chuckling. "Before. The librarian who came before Malachi, many years ago." "Who was that?" "I do not remember. He died when Malachi was still young." "And the one who came before Malachi's master, and was a young assistant librarian when I was young." "But I never set foot in the library." "Labyrinth? The library is a labyrinth?" "Hunc mundum typus labyrinthus denoted ill," the old man recited, absently. "Intranti largus, radianti sed nimis artis." The library is a great labyrinth, sign of the labyrinth of the world. You enter and you do not know whether you will come out. You must not transgress the pillars of Hercules. So you don't know how one enters the library when the edificium doors are closed. "Oh, yes." The old man laughed. "Many know. You go by way of the ossarium. You can go through the ossarium, but you do not want to go through the ossarium. The dead monks keep watch. Those dead monks who keep watch, they are not those who move at night through the library with a lamp." "With a lamp?" The old man seemed amazed. "I have never heard this story. The dead monks stay in the ossarium. The bones drop gradually from the cemetery and collect there, to guard the passage. Have you never seen the altar of the chapel that leads to the ossarium? It is the third on the left, after the transept, is it not?" "The third? Perhaps. It is the one whose altar stone is carved with 1,000 skeletons. The 4th skull on the right. Press the eyes, and you are in the ossarium. But do not go there, I have never gone. The abbot does not wish it. And the beast? Where did you see the beast?" "The beast? Ah, the Antichrist. He is about to come, the millennium is past, we await him." "But the millennium was 300 years ago, and he did not come then." "The Antichrist does not come after 1,000 years have passed. When the 1,000 years have passed, the reign of the just begins, then comes the Antichrist, to confound the just, and then there will be the final battle." "But the just will reign for 1,000 years, William said. "Or else they reigned from the death of Christ to the end of the first millennium, and so the Antichrist should have come then. Or else the just have not yet reigned, and the Antichrist is still far off." The millennium is not calculated from the death of Christ but from the donation of Constantine, 3 centuries later. Now it is 1,000 years. So the reign of the just is ending? I do not know. I do not know anymore. I am tired. The calculation is difficult. Beatus of Libana made it. Ask Jorge, he is young, he remembers well. But the time is ripe. Did you not hear the 7 trumpets? Why the 7 trumpets? Did you not hear how the other boy died, the illuminator? The first angel sounded the first trumpet, and hail and fire fell mingled with blood. And the second angel sounded the second trumpet, and the third part of the sea became blood. Did the second boy not die in the sea of blood? Watch out for the third trumpet. The third part of the creatures in the sea will die. God punishes us. The world all around the abbey is rank with heresy. They tell me that on the throne of Rome there is a perverse pope who uses hosts for practices of necromancy, and feeds them to his mores. And in our midst someone has violated the ban, has broken the seals of the labyrinth. Who told you that? I heard it. All were whispering that sin has entered the abbey. Do you have any chickpeas? The question, addressed to me, surprised me. No, I have no chickpeas, I said, confused. Next time, bring me some chickpeas. I hold them in my mouth. You see my poor toothless mouth? Until they are soft. They stimulate saliva, aqua fons vitae. Will you bring me some chickpeas tomorrow? Tomorrow I will bring you some chickpeas, I said to him. But he had dozed off. We left him and went to the refectory. Compline, in which the edificium is entered, a mysterious visitor is discovered, a secret message with necromantic signs is found, and also a book is found, but then promptly vanishes, to be sought through many subsequent chapters. Nor is the theft of William's precious lenses the last of the vicissitudes. The supper was joyless and silent. It had been just over 12 hours since the discovery of Venantius's co-arse. All the others stole glimpses at his empty place at table. When it was the hour for Compline, the procession that marched into the choir seemed a funeral cortege. We followed the office standing in the nave and keeping an eye on the third chapel. The light was scant, and when we saw Malachi emerge from the darkness to reach his stall, we could not tell exactly where he had come from. We moved into the shadows, hiding in the side nave, so that no one would see us stay behind when the office was over. Under my scapular I had the lamp I had purloined in the kitchen during supper. We would light it later at the great bronze tripod that burned all night. I had procured a new wick and ample oil. We would have light for a long time. I was too excited about our imminent venture to pay attention to the service, which ended almost without my noticing. The monks lowered their cowls over their faces and slowly filed out, to go to their cells. The church remained deserted, illuminated by the glow of the tripod. Now, William said, to work. We approached the third chapel. The base of the altar was really like an ossarium, a series of skulls with deep hollow eye sockets, which filled those who looked at them with terror, set on a pile of what, in the admirable relief, appeared to be tibias. William repeated in a low voice the words he had heard from Alenardo, fourth skull on the right, press the eyes. He stuck his fingers into the sockets of that fleshless face, and at once we heard a kind of hoarse creak. The altar moved, turning on a hidden pivot, allowing a glimpse of a dark aperture. As I shed light on it with my raised lamp, we made out some damp steps. We decided to go down them, after debating whether to close off the passage again behind us. Better not, William said. We did not know whether we would be able to reopen it afterward. And as for the risk of being discovered, if anyone came at that hour to operate the same mechanism, that meant he knew how to enter, and a closed passage would not deter him. We descended perhaps a dozen steps and came into a corridor on whose sides there were some horizontal niches, such as I was later to see in many catacombs. But now I was entering an ossarium for the first time, and I was very much afraid. The monks' bones had been collected there over the centuries, dug from the earth and piled in the niches with no attempt to recompose the forms of their bodies. Some niches had only tiny bones, others only skulls, neatly arranged in a kind of pyramid, so that one would not roll over another, and it was a truly terrifying sight, especially in the play of shadows the lamp created as we walked on. In one niche I saw only hands, many hands, now irrevocably interlaced in a tangle of dead fingers. I let out a cry in that place of the dead, for a moment sensing some presence above, a squeaking, a rapid movement in the dark. Mice, William said, to reassure me. What are mice doing here? Passing through, like us. Because the ossarium leads to the edificium and then to the kitchen. And to the tasty books of the library. And now you understand why Malachi's face is so austere. His duties oblige him to come through here twice daily, morning and evening. Truly he has nothing to laugh about. But why doesn't the gospel ever say that Christ laughed? I asked, for no good reason. Is Jorge right? Legions of scholars have wondered whether Christ laughed. The question doesn't interest me much. I believe he never laughed, because, omniscient as the Son of God had to be, he knew how we Christians would behave. But here we are, and, in fact, the corridor was ending, thank God, new steps began. After climbing them, we would have only to push an ironclad wooden door and we would find ourselves behind the fireplace of the kitchen, just below the circular staircase leading to the scriptorium. As we went up, we thought we heard a noise above us. We remained a moment in silence, then I said, it's impossible. No one came in before us. assuming this is the only way into the edificium. In centuries past this was a fortress, and it must have more secret entrances than we know of. We'll go up slowly, but we have little choice. If we put out the light we can't see where we are going. If we leave it burning we give anyone upstairs the alarm. Our only hope is that if someone really is there, he will be afraid of us. We reached the scriptorium, emerging from the south tower. Venantius's desk was directly opposite. The room was so vast that, as we moved, we illuminated only a few yards of wall at a time. We hoped no one was in the court, to see the light through the windows. The desk appeared to be in order, but William bent at once to examine the pages on the shelf below, and he cried out in dismay. "Is something missing?" I asked. "Today I saw 2 books here, one of them in Greek. And that's the one missing. Somebody has taken it, and in great haste, because one page fell on the floor here. But the desk was watched. Of course. Perhaps somebody grabbed it just a short while ago. Perhaps he's still here." He turned toward the shadows and his voice echoed among the columns. "If you are here, beware." It seemed to me a good idea, as William had said before. It is always better when the person who frightens us is also afraid of us. William set down the page he had found under the desk and bent his face toward it. He asked me for more light. I held the lamp closer and saw a page, the first half of it blank, the second covered with tiny characters whose origin I recognized with some difficulty. "Is it Greek?" I asked. "Yes, but I don't understand clearly." He took his lenses from his habit and set them firmly astride his nose, then bent his head again. "It's Greek, written in a very fine hand, and yet in a disorderly way. Even with my lenses I have trouble reading it. I need still more light. Come closer." He had picked up the sheet of parchment, holding it to his face, and instead of stepping behind him and holding the lamp high over his head, I foolishly stood directly in front of him. He asked me to move aside, and as I did, I grazed the back of the page with the flame. William pushed me away, asking me whether I wanted to burn the manuscript for him. Then he cried out. I saw clearly that some vague signs, in a yellow-brown color, had appeared on the upper part of the page. William made me give him the lamp and moved it behind the page, holding the flame fairly close to the surface of the parchment, which he heated without setting it afire. Slowly, as if an invisible hand were writing, Maine, Tekel, Perez, I saw some marks emerge one by one on the white side of the sheet as William moved the lamp, and as the smoke that rose from the top of the flame blackened the recto. The marks did not resemble those of any alphabet, except that of necromancers. "Fantastic," William said, "more and more interesting." He looked around. "But it would be better not to expose this discovery to the tricks of our mysterious companion, if he is still here." He took off his lenses, set them on the desk, then carefully rolled up the parchment and hid it inside his habit. Still amazed by this sequence of events, which were nothing if not miraculous, I was about to ask further explanations when all of a sudden a sharp sound distracted us. It came from the foot of the east stairway, leading to the library. "Our man is there. After him," William shouted, and we flung ourselves in that direction, he moving faster, I more slowly, for I was carrying the lamp. I heard the clatter of someone stumbling and falling. I ran, and found William at the foot of the steps, observing a heavy volume, its binding reinforced with metal studs. At that same moment we heard another noise, in the direction from which we had come. "Fool that I am," William cried. "Hurry, to Venantius's desk." I understood. Somebody, from the shadows behind us, had thrown the volume to send us far away. Once again William was faster than I and reached the desk first. Following him, I glimpsed among the columns a fleeing shadow, taking the stairway of the west tower. Seized with warlike ardor, I thrust the lamp into William's hand and dashed blindly off toward the stairs where the fugitive had descended. At that moment I felt like a soldier of Christ fighting all the legions of hell, and I burned with the desire to lay my hands on the stranger, to turn him over to my master. I tumbled down almost the whole stairway, tripping over the hem of my habit. That was the only moment of my life, I swear, when I regretted having entered a monastic order. But at that same instant, and it was the thought of an instant, I consoled myself with the idea that my adversary was suffering the same impediment. And, further, if he had taken the book, he would have his hands full. From behind the bread oven I almost dived into the kitchen, and in the starry light that faintly illuminated the vast entrance, I saw the shadow I was pursuing as it slipped past the refectory door, then pulled this shut. I rushed toward the door. I labored a few seconds opening it, entered, looked around, and saw no one. The outside door was still barred. I turned. Shadows and silence. I noticed a glow advancing from the kitchen and I flattened myself against a wall. On the threshold of the passage between the two rooms a figure appeared, illuminated by a lamp. I cried out. It was William. Nobody around? I foresaw that. He didn't go out through a door? He didn't take the passage through the osarium? No, he went out through here, but I don't know where. I told you. There are other passages, and it's useless for us to look for them. Perhaps our man is emerging at some distant spot. And with him my lenses. Your lenses? Yes. Our friend could not take the page away from me, but with great presence of mind, as he rushed past, he snatched my glasses from the desk. Why? Because he is no fool. He heard me speak of these notes, he realized they were important, he assumed that without my lenses I would be unable to decipher them, and he knows for sure that I would not entrust them to anyone else. In fact, now it's as if I didn't have them. But how did he know about your lenses? Come. Apart from the fact that we spoke about them yesterday with the master glazier, this morning in the scriptorium I put them on to search among Venantius's papers. So there are many people who could know how valuable those objects are to me. Actually, I could read a normal manuscript, but not this one. And he was again unrolling the mysterious parchment. The part in Greek is written too fine and the upper part is too hazy. He showed me the mysterious signs that had appeared as if by magic in the heat of the flame. Venantius wanted to conceal an important secret, and he used one of those inks that leave no trace when written but reappear when warmed. Or else he used lemon juice. But since I don't know what substance he used and the signs could disappear again. Quickly, you who have good eyes, copy them at once as faithfully as you can, perhaps enlarging them a bit. And so I did, without knowing what I was copying. It was a series of 4 or 5 lines, really necromantic, and I will reproduce only the very first signs, to give the reader an idea of the puzzle I had before my eyes. When I had finished copying, William looked, unfortunately without lenses, holding my tablet at some distance from his nose. It is unquestionably a secret alphabet that will have to be deciphered, he said. The signs are badly drawn, and perhaps you copied them worse, but it is certainly a zodiacal alphabet. You see? In the first line we have, he held the page away from him again and narrowed his eyes with an effort of concentration, Sagittarius, Sun, Mercury, Scorpio. And what do they mean? If Venantius had been ingenious he would have used the most common zodiacal alphabet. A equals Sun, B equals Jupiter. The first line would then read, try transcribing this, RACQASVL. He broke off. No, it means nothing, and Venantius was not ingenious. He reformulated the alphabet according to another key. I shall have to discover it. Is it possible? I asked, awed. Yes, if you know a bit of the learning of the Arabs. The best treatises on cryptography are the work of infidel scholars, and at Oxford I was able to have some read to me. Bacon was right in saying that the conquest of learning is achieved through the knowledge of languages. Abu Bakr Ahmad ben Ali ben Washaya an-Nabati wrote centuries ago a book of the frenzied desire of the devout to learn the riddles of ancient writings, and he expounded many rules for composing and deciphering mysterious alphabets, useful for magic practices but also for the correspondence between armies, or between a king and his envoys. I have seen other Arab books that list a series of quite ingenious devices. For example, you can substitute one letter for another, you can write a word backward, you can put the letters to reverse order, using only every other one. And then starting over again, you can, as in this case, replace letters with zodiacal signs, but attributing to the hidden letters their numerical value, and then, according to another alphabet, convert the numbers into other letters. And which of these systems can Venantius have used? We would have to test them all, and others besides. But the first rule in deciphering a message is to guess what it means. But then it's unnecessary to decipher it. I laughed. Not exactly. Some hypotheses can be formed on the possible first words of the message, and then you see whether the rule you infer from them can apply to the rest of the text. For example, here, Venantius has certainly noted down the key for penetrating the finis Africae. If I try thinking that the message is about this, then I am suddenly enlightened by a rhythm. Try looking at the first 3 words, not considering the letters, but the number of the signs. I. Now try dividing them into syllables of at least 2 signs each, and recite aloud. Ta-ta-ta. Ta-ta, ta-ta-ta. Doesn't anything come to your mind? No. To mine, yes. Secretum finis Africae. But if this were correct, then the last word should have the same first and 6th letter, and so it does, in fact. The symbol of the earth is there twice. And the first letter of the first word, the S, should be the same as the last of the second, and, sure enough, the sign of the Virgin is repeated. Perhaps this is the right track. But it could also be just a series of coincidences. A rule of correspondence has to be found. Found where? In our heads. Invent it, and then see whether it is the right one. But with one test and another, the game could cost me a whole day. No more than that because, remember this, there is no secret writing that cannot be deciphered with a bit of patience. But now we risk losing time, and we want to visit the library. Especially since, without lenses, I will never be able to read the second part of the message, and you cannot help me because these signs, to your eyes. Grecum est, non legitor, I finished his sentence, humiliated. It is Greek to me. Exactly, and you see that Bacon was right. Study, but we must not lose heart. We'll put away the parchment in your notes, and we'll go up to the library. Because tonight not even 10 infernal legions will succeed in keeping us out. I blessed myself. But who can he have been, the man who was here ahead of us? Benno? Benno was burning with the desire to know what there was among Venantius's papers, but I can't see him as one with the courage to enter the edificium at night. Berengar, then? Or Malachi? Berengar seems to me to have the courage to do such things. And, after all, he shares responsibility for the library. He is consumed by remorse at having betrayed some secret of it. He thought Venantius had taken that book, and perhaps he wanted to return it to the place from which it comes. He wasn't able to go upstairs, and now he is hiding the volume somewhere. But it could also be Malachi, for the same motives. I would say no. Malachi had all the time he wanted to search Venantius's desk when he remained alone to shut up the edificium. I knew that very well, but there was no way to avoid it. Now we know he didn't do it. And if you think carefully, we have no reason to think Malachi knows Venantius had entered the library and removed something. Berengar and Benno know this, and you and I know it. After Adelmo's confession, Jorge may know it, but he was surely not the man who was rushing so furiously down the circular staircase. Then either Berengar or Benno. And why not Pacificus of Tivoli or another of the monks we saw here today? Or Nicholas the Glazier, who knows about my glasses? Or that odd character Salvatore, who they have told us roams around at night on God knows what errands? We must take care not to restrict the field of suspects just because Benno's revelations have oriented us in a single direction. Perhaps Benno wanted to mislead us. But he seems sincere to you. Certainly, but remember that the first duty of a good inquisitor is to suspect especially those who seem sincere to him. A nasty job, being an inquisitor. That's why I gave it up. And as you say, I am forced to resume it. But come now, to the library. Night, in which the labyrinth is finally broached, and the intruders have strange visions and, as happens in labyrinths, lose their way. We climbed back up to the scriptorium, this time by the east staircase, which rose also to the forbidden floor. Holding the light high before us, I thought of Alenardo's words about the labyrinth, and I expected frightful things. I was surprised, as we emerged into the place we should not have entered, at finding myself in a not very large room with 7 sides, windowless, where there reigned, as, for that matter, throughout the whole floor, a strong odor of stagnation or mold. Nothing terrifying. The room, as I said, had 7 walls, but only 4 of them had an opening, a passage flanked by 2 little columns set in the wall. The opening was fairly wide, surmounted by a round-headed arch. Against the blind walls stood huge cases, laden with books neatly arranged. Each case bore a scroll with a number, and so did each individual shelf, obviously the same numbers we had seen in the catalogue. In the midst of the room was a table, also covered with books. On all the volumes lay a fairly light coat of dust, sign that the books were cleaned with some frequency. Nor was there dirt of any kind on the floor. Above one of the archways, a big scroll, painted on the wall, bore the words, Apocalypsis Iesu Christi. It did not seem faded, even though the lettering was ancient. We noticed afterward, also in the other rooms, that these scrolls were actually carved in the stone, cut fairly deeply, and the depressions had subsequently been filled with color, as painters do in fresco in churches. We passed through one of the openings. We found ourselves in another room, where there was a window that, in place of glass panes, had slabs of alabaster, with 2 blind walls and 1 aperture, like the one we had just come through. It opened into another room, which also had 2 blind walls, another with a window, and another passage that opened opposite us. In these 2 rooms, the 2 scrolls were similar in form to the first we had seen, but with different words. The scroll in the first room said, Super Thronos Vigenti Quatuor, and the one in the second room, Nomen Illi Mors. For the rest, even though the 2 rooms were smaller than the one by which we had entered the library, actually, that one was heptagonal, these 2 rectangular. The furnishing was the same. We entered the 3rd room. It was bare of books and had no scroll. Under the window, a stone altar. There were 3 doors. The one by which we had entered, another, leading to the heptagonal room already visited, and a 3rd, which led to a new room, no different from the others except for the scroll, which said, Obscuratus est sol et air, announcing the growing darkness of sun and air. From here you went into a new room, whose scroll said, Facta est grando et ignis, threatening turmoil and fire. This room was without other apertures. Once you reached it, you could proceed no farther and had to turn back. Let us think about this, William said. 5 quadrangular or vaguely trapezoidal rooms, each with 1 window, arranged around a windowless heptagonal room to which the stairway leads. It seems elementary to me. We are in the East Tower. From the outside each tower shows 5 windows and 5 sides. It works out. The empty room is the one facing east, the same direction as the choir of the church. The dawn sun illuminates the altar, which I find right and pious. The only clever idea, it seems to me, is the use of alabaster slabs. In the daytime they admit a fine light, and at night not even the moon's rays can penetrate. Now let's see where the other 2 doors of the heptagonal room lead. My master was mistaken, and the builders of the library had been shrewder than we thought. I cannot explain clearly what happened, but as we left the tower room, the order of the rooms became more confused. Some had 2 doorways, others 3. All had 1 window each, even those we entered from a windowed room, thinking we were heading toward the interior of the edificium. Each had always the same kind of cases and tables. The books arrayed to neat order seemed all the same and certainly did not help us to recognize our location at a glance. We tried to orient ourselves by the scrolls. Once we crossed a room in which was written, In Dibus Illis, in those days, and after some roaming we thought we had come back to it. But we remembered that the door opposite the window led into a room whose scroll said, Primogenitus Mortuorum, the firstborn of the dead, whereas now we came upon another that again said, Apocalypsis Iesu Christi, though it was not the heptagonal room from which we had set out. This fact convinced us that sometimes the scrolls repeated the same words in different rooms. We found 2 rooms with apocalypses, one after the other, and, immediately following them, one with Succided de Cielo Stella Magna, a great star fell from the heavens. The source of the phrases on the scrolls was obvious. They were verses from the Apocalypse of John, but it was not at all clear why they were painted on the walls or what logic was behind their arrangement. To increase our confusion, we discovered that some scrolls, not many, were colored red instead of black. At a certain point we found ourselves again in the original heptagonal room, easily identified because the stairwell began there, and we resumed moving toward our right, trying to go straight from room to room. We went through 3 rooms and then found ourselves facing a blank wall. The only opening led into a new room that had only one other aperture, which we went through, and then, after another 4 rooms, we found ourselves again facing a wall. We returned to the previous room, which had 2 exits, took the one we had not tried before, went into a new room, and then found ourselves back in the heptagonal room of the outset. What was the name of the last room, the one where we began retracing our steps? William asked. I strained my memory and I had a vision of a white horse, Equus albus. Good. Let's find it again. And it was easy. From there, if we did not want to turn back as we had before, we could only pass through the room called Gratia Vobis et Pax, and from there, on the right, we thought we found a new passage, which did not take us back. Actually we again came upon Indibus Illis, and Primogenitus Mortuorum. Were they the rooms of a few moments earlier? Then finally we came to a room that we did not seem to have visited before. Tertia pars terrae combusta est. But even when we had learned that a third of the earth had been burned up, we still did not know what our position was with respect to the east tower. Holding the lamp in front of me, I ventured into the next rooms. A giant of threatening dimensions, a swaying and fluttering form came toward me, like a ghost. A devil, I cried and almost dropped the lamp as I wheeled around and took refuge in William's arms. He seized the lamp from my hands and, thrusting me aside, stepped forward with a decisiveness that to me seemed sublime. He also saw something, because he brusquely stepped back. Then he leaned forward again and raised the lamp. He burst out laughing. Really ingenious. A mirror. A mirror? Yes, my bold warrior. You flung yourself so courageously on a real enemy a short while ago in the scriptorium, and now you are frightened by your own image. A mirror that reflects your image, enlarged and distorted. He took me by the hand and led me up to the wall facing the entrance to the room. On a corrugated sheet of glass, now that the light illuminated it more closely, I saw our 2 images, grotesquely misshapen, changing form and height as we moved closer or stepped back. You must read some treatise on optics, William said, amused, as the creators of the library surely did. The best ones are by the Arabs. Alhazen wrote a treatise, De Aspectibus, in which, with precise geometrical demonstrations, he spoke of the power of mirrors, some of which, depending on how their surface is gauged, can enlarge the tiniest things. What else are my lenses? While others make images appear upside down, or oblique, or show 2 objects in the place of 1, and 4 in place of 2. Still others, like this one, turn a dwarf into a giant or a giant into a dwarf. Lord Jesus, I exclaimed. Are these, then, the visions some say they have had in the library? Perhaps. A really clever idea. He read the scroll on the wall, over the mirror, Super Thronos Vigenti Quatuor. The 24 elders upon their seats. We have seen this inscription before, but it was a room without any mirror. This one, moreover, has no windows, and yet it is not heptagonal. Where are we? He looked around and went over to a case. Adza, without those wondrous oculi ad legendum I cannot figure out what is written on these books. Read me some titles. I picked out a book at random. Master, it is not written. What do you mean? I can see it is written. What do you read? I am not reading. These are not letters of the alphabet, and it is not Greek. I would recognize it. They look like worms, snakes, fly dung. Ah, it's Arabic. Are there others like it? Yes, several. But here is one in Latin, thank God. Al-Khwarizmi, Tabulae, the astronomical tables of Al-Khwarizmi, translated by Adelard of Bath. A very rare work. Continue. Isa ibn Ali, de Oculis, Alkindi, de Radiis Slelatus. Now look on the table. I opened a great volume lying on the table, a de Bastis. I happened on a delicately illuminated page where a very beautiful unicorn was depicted. Beautifully made, William commented, able to see the illustrations well. And that? I read. Lider Monstrorum de Diversis Generibus. This also has beautiful images, but they seem older to me. William bent his face to the text. Illuminated by Irish monks, at least 5 centuries ago. The Unicorn Book, on the other hand, is much more recent. It seems to me made in the French fashion. Once again I admired my master's erudition. We entered the next room and crossed the 4 rooms after it, all with windows, and all filled with volumes in unknown languages, in addition to